At RAM, the campus was supposed to be asleep, the libraries were closed, the lecture halls were dark, and even the most ambitious students had long since returned to their dorms. But under the soft glow of a single desk lamp in a quiet academic building, one student was still wide awake. What happened that night would not only change her future, it would challenge the way an entire institution saw potential. 40 study room. She sat alone in a nearly empty study room. Pages of equations spread around her like puzzle pieces waiting to be solved. Her notebook was filled with dense symbols, complex formulas, and corrections scratched out only to be rewritten more precisely. She wasn't working on a sign, she was working on something far beyond her syllabus, a graduate-level problem she had discovered while browsing research journals online. Most people who passed by would have assumed she was just another tired student cramming for exams, but the intensity in her eyes told a different story. She wasn't memorizing steps, she was building new ones. Rinjas, Parkambi Stakshwi, Kampopi Separ, Warwan. Each line of math was deliberate, each variable carried weight. She paused only to think deeper, not because she was stuck down the hall. A door clicked open. The director of advanced research at Harvard had returned to retrieve a folder he had forgotten earlier that evening. He was used to late nights, but he did not expect to see light spilling from a study room at that hour. Curious, he walked closer. Through the glass, he saw her standing at a whiteboard covered in complex equations. At first glance, he assumed she was reviewing material, but as he read the symbols, his steps slowed. His expression shifted. She wasn't reviewing standard coursework. She was reconstructing a theorem his department had been debating for months. He didn't interrupt her immediately. Instead, he stood quietly observing as she worked through a proof that had frustrated doctoral candidates and visiting scholars alike. She made an adjustment midway through, erased half the board, and rewrote the structure of the equation with sharper logic. Finally, he knocked gently and stepped inside. She startled slightly but quickly composed herself. She assumed she might be asked to leave, maybe reminded of building hours. Instead, he looked at the board and asked a simple question. Why did you change the substitution variable there? She hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. Then she explained. Calmly, clearly. She described how the traditional method created an unnecessary constraint and how adjusting the substitution opened a cleaner path to the solution. She spoke with quiet confidence, not arrogance, just clarity. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause. He looked at the board again, then back at her. Show me the final step, he said. She turned back to the equations, her hand steady despite the weight of the moment. Within minutes, she completed the proof, not perfectly polished, but undeniably sound. The solution aligned with a direction his department had only theorized. RSRTAM, in a silent building meant to be empty, something extraordinary had just happened. He asked her what program she was in, told him she was an undergraduate on scholarship, majoring in applied mathematics. He mentioned she often studied ahead because she wanted to understand concepts deeply, not just pass exams. He admitted she had been following his department's published research online, trying to learn from it on her own. He studied her for a moment, recognizing not just intelligence but hunger. What he did next would ripple far beyond that hallway. Instead of telling her to go home and rest, he invited her to present her reasoning at the next departmental meeting. She thought he was joking. He wasn't. By morning, emails had been sent. By afternoon, professors were whispering. And by the end of the week, quiet RAM study session had turned into the beginning of something no one saw coming. The campus that usually slept at night would soon be wide awake. When she walked into the conference room 3 days later, she felt every pair of eyes turned toward her. Professors with decades of research experience sat around the long table. Doctoral candidates lined the walls. The same whiteboard that had witnessed intense academic debates now stood waiting for her. She could feel the pressure. Kushrateking. She was young, she was an undergraduate, and she was stepping into a room where reputations were built on intellectual rigor. The director nodded at her reassuringly. Korentrolls a poor chobers. Go ahead. She took a breath and began. She didn't rush. She laid out the problem clearly, explaining the flaw in the conventional assumption. She recreated the path she had taken walking through the substitution shift and demonstrating how it removed the structural bottleneck in the proof. At first, the room was skeptical. A few professors leaned back with folded arms. One interrupted with a pointed question. She listened carefully, then answered with precision. Another challenged her logic. She rewrote a section of the equation to clarify the step. Slowly, the skepticism faded. By the time she reached the final line of the proof, the room was silent. Not dismissive silence, thoughtful silence. One senior professor leaned forward. If this holds under peer review, he said quietly, this could reshape our approach. The director didn't look surprised. He had seen her process already. What impressed him wasn't just the result. It was her discipline at RAM. When no one was watching. No applause, no credit. Just pure curiosity driving her forward. The meeting ended differently than most. Instead of dispersing immediately, several professors approached her with questions, not to challenge but to collaborate. Opportunities were discussed. What's captures? research assistant positions, mentorship, a potential company-authored paper. But what mattered most wasn't the offers, it was the shift. An institution known for prestige had just been reminded that brilliance does not announce itself with titles. Sometimes it sits quietly in a study room long after midnight, working through problems simply because it refuses to stop learning. Weeks later, when her name appeared alongside senior researchers on a published paper, many people called it sudden success. They called it overnight recognition. But the director knew better. He remembered the empty hallway, the single desk lamp, the sound of a marker moving confidently across a whiteboard at 4 a.m. What he did that night wasn't charity, wasn't luck, it was recognition.